Okay, we've got about 250 on, so let's start kicking it off. So everyone who's on, if you could type in the chat where you're from. I see Claire is coming in from Canada. We have Ivan. Please share in the chat where you are right now. How many of you are in Singapore and where in the world? Someone from Singapore, just type it out where you're from. That'd be good to know. Awesome. So it was like someone in the team said this morning that it's really good that we're doing this tonight because next week everyone will just be out partying. So, really good timing. And especially in Singapore, they will open up from Friday onwards. So I think people are already starting to plan their Friday evening plans and so on. So it's a good, hopefully last night that we're still in-house indoors in Singapore. So thanks a lot for being here with us tonight. My name is Nelly Wartoft. I'm the founder and CEO of Tigerhall. So many of you would be part of the Tigerhall community already, and you have heard the three people on the panel here on the app as well. For those of you who are joining us for the first time tonight, Tigerhall is what we call success enablement. So we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to reach their life goals and become successful at what they do, regardless of their background and circumstances. And we're doing this with a great help of some of Asia's most successful and interesting individuals, Parag, Simon, and Deborah included, where you can learn directly from them and senior business leaders and experts through a range of different formats, including digital content like podcasts, power reads, live streams, but also interactive formats like group mentoring sessions, virtual dinners, and much more. So we're in the business of constantly monitoring what people's challenges are and what people want to learn about. And a fun fact on that is that one of the most popular podcasts on Tigerhall right now is actually what to do when your annoying remote colleague is ignoring you. So that speaks of the topical and what's happening right now in the world. But apart from all the remote work content, we've also received a lot of questions around what is happening in the world right now and what the long-term impact of this will be, and especially the big question, are we all screwed? So that's what we're going to discuss tonight. And we're here with 3 doctors tonight, but still COVID is going on in the world, so I don't know what's happening. So we'll see where we get to with this discussion. So with us tonight, we have Parag Khanna, who probably requires no introduction for most of you, best-selling author, managing director of FutureMap, and works with some of the world's largest corporations and governments on looking into the crystal ball of the future and see what's going to happen. And then we have Deborah Elms, who's heading up the Asian Trade Center and helps create a better trade policy for Asia. Deborah also launched and ran the Temasek Foundation Center for Trade and Negotiations, so a true specialist in this area. And lastly, we have Simon Milner, who leads public policy for Facebook in Asia Pacific. So he's helping navigating government policies to ensure that we all can see each other's breakfast and cat videos properly, and nothing of that is getting disturbed. And Simon has also had the pleasure of being cross-examined by the Singapore government for several hours about the fake news and the Cambridge Analytica incident. So that's not for the faint-hearted. So today, during the conversations, feel free to post your questions, your thoughts, and your comments in the chat window, and we'll make sure to bring them into the conversation. So starting with coming back to that big question, are we all screwed? Let's start with a poll to see what is the opinion today and where does this lie today? So let's see what the audience think. It's very interesting to see these poll movements.
No, you're not allowing us to vote. I just got blocked from voting. What kind of democratic process is this?
Democracy is not part of the future, we'll see.
Would I ever say something like that?
Okay, so we have 80% voted. I'll give it a few more seconds. And we'll end. So we've got a pretty positive audience. 76% think we're not screwed, and every 4th person think we are. What do you think? What are if you had to vote in this poll, what would you think, Parag? Do you say yes or no?
I would agree with the mob. You know, we're not, and I think though a lot of it's it depends on where you sit, so to speak. And, I believe we're moving into a world in which there's kind of a North American system, a European system, and an Asian sort of system. And so people are rightly a bit more optimistic in this part of the world. One of the things you may have seen recently, just yesterday in the news, that for the first time since surveys have been done, a majority of white Americans say that they are not extremely proud to be American, which is really, quite arresting a data point. But that's just a brief comment.
Interesting. Simon, your thoughts?
So I'm also with the mob as parents, right? I'm always optimistic, and generally I've been proved that that's the right place in the spectrum to be. Also, because I think if you're pessimistic, you just, it's hard to get up. I had to get out of bed in the morning. But I also work for a company that genuinely believes that we can continue to make the world better. It's going to be hugely challenging, and these are new challenges, but they also create pretty significant change that sure we're going to talk about, which I think will create opportunities for this region, and particularly for innovators and for the kind of the millennials that you particularly are very interested in, people who are starting out in their career. Incredible opportunities from the changes that we're seeing. So I'm optimistic, but it's going to be tough. Let's be clear.
Yeah. So the young people should still be positive.
Yeah, maybe not quite positive about the next few months. I just want to be clear, it's going to be tough. I've got kids and myself who are just graduating, and they're extremely worried. I can understand that. So if you're employed and your company's going to be okay and get through it, I think that's going to make a big difference.
Deborah, would you think otherwise, or do you agree with them?
Well, I don't think you start companies if you're not an optimist. So I'm going to say, we are not screwed, but partly because you have to be very nimble and flexible in order to navigate these really challenging times. And I think that again, it's much easier for me to say we're not screwed when we're sitting comfortably in Singapore with video capabilities and so forth. I think if we were asking a different demographic, they might have a different perspective on this, but at least for me personally, I think I'm optimistic. We can work our way through this, as challenging as it will be. And of course, when you're knowledge workers in an economy that favors knowledge workers, then you're going to be better off than if you're not.
For sure. Interesting. So, Parag, your book, The Future is Asian, which I've read and I love, it was a bestseller, but I'm guessing many of your predictions when you wrote that book for the future did not have COVID in the middle of it, right? So if you were to write another best-selling book as a follow-on, what would the title of that book be?
Well, I could have called this one The Present is Asian and the Future is Chaos. Because that seems to be what many people believe. But the fact is that as tragic and terrible and long-lasting the effects will be of this pandemic, let's be clear, of this, as I mentioned earlier, this sort of tripolar, trifurcated world that's very regionalized that we're moving into, this is probably still the region you want to be in. From an economic standpoint, when you think about the demographics, half the world's population, half the world's GDP, yes, every region of the world is in a recession for now, but I think that if you did a poll, and even if you didn't do a poll, everyone knows that this is going to be the only region of the world that will start growing in a meaningful way anytime soon, again, in the meaningful future. So, it's not really, in a way, as huge an event as this pandemic has been, from this standpoint of the time horizons that I look at, it is actually just a blip. It actually is just that, and again, I'm not belittling the pandemic, but I'm talking about a much larger set of processes about how a region like Asia becomes the system that it's becoming, this process of interdependence. And I want to emphasize that involves not only the tragic events like the pandemic and even forces like climate change, and let's not forget conflict, war. This is all part of the process. Right now you have the tensions in the South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and obviously India and China. I spend a lot of time excavating, and going to each of those issues. War and conflict are not somehow invalidating the argument about what Asia is becoming. They are part of the story. They're an intimate part of the story. The reason you have a European Union today is because you had a century of violent warfare, right? Genocidal warfare. Let's hope we don't have any more of those in Asia. But these conflicts are part of the process. The subtitle of the book actually was Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century. But the way in which Asians do conflict is not necessarily the Western way. And these sort of civilizational tensions that you see going on are not necessarily going to follow historical patterns. So one thing that I would like to be, at this point, it seems silly to say this, but it would make me just mildly or cautiously optimistic, is that even with this this escalation that's going on right now, what we've seen over the last 30 years is that even in moments like this, the great powers in Asia tend to step back a little bit, from the brink. So I'm not, there's no reason, literally no reason whatsoever to back away from the idea that the future is Asian, because again, it's also about all of Asia. And part of it, and one of the main motivations, was to say that the future is Asian, and that means not just China, right? And that's really a huge part. And what you see happening right now, the deep mega trend right now in geopolitics and geoeconomics in Asia, is that we're moving beyond just China. In the world of supply chains, it's China plus one, right? Or a supply chain shifting towards Southeast Asia, towards India, or at least a dissipation so that you don't have this over-concentration in China. In geopolitics, you have Europe, America, Australia, Japan competing with Belt and Road in their own initiatives to finance infrastructure and help countries grow with less Chinese debt. So you have this process, again, long-term, that is very, very clear to see. It's not some distant twinkle in the eye. It's happening right now. You start to see Asia returning to the pattern it's most familiar with, most comfortable with, and most stable in, which is multipolarity, no dominant power. And that means that we should all take comfort in the fact that the future is going to be Asian and not Chinese. That's a good thing for all of Asia, and it's actually a very good thing for China too.
Mm. So probably the future is Asian commerce, COVID, and conflict.
Don't forget culture. I wouldn't want to rule out culture. To me, it's
culture is better than conflict.
Factor. So we'll just add yet another comma. Or you know what? I think I'll just write something completely different.
Excellent. So Deborah, from the work that you're doing with businesses and across the region, do you see this as a blip as well? Is that the sense that you're getting from the organizations that you work with?
No, I don't think it's just a blip. I think it depends on, again, sort of who you talk to. So for small businesses, this is potentially catastrophic. So this is not just a blip. This is the end of your business model. And it could be the end of your business model even when you had a very flourishing business. It could be the end of your business even if it's long-standing. So I think for many companies, it's more than just a blip. It's this, they're completely overwhelmed. Come up with the adjective that makes you happiest. It's the tsunami, it's the whatever, and it's washed them out to sea. Even businesses that have been extremely profitable are suddenly struggling. And I am struck in particular by the number of firms that we've been talking to across the spectrum who are really lost and not certain, at least for the interim. Now, of course, I'm an optimist, so at some point in the future, we will look back on this and maybe it looks like a blip, but for today and the individuals living today, trying to figure out how do we survive. We've lost supply of a lot of the things that we need. We've certainly lost demand for a lot of the services or a lot of the goods that we were selling. We're not certain what the future looks like. We're nervous about our own jobs. We're nervous about our ability to take care of our children, our families, our parents, whatever. So I think at this moment, while you can see that the audience on this call is broadly optimistic, I think, again, the picture is challenging for now. Now, at some point, small businesses, for example, are famous for being able to pivot, find opportunities. I'm not suggesting there aren't opportunities out there. I just think that at this moment, it feels not like a blip. And I suppose that that's the case in every sort of major crisis. This is the biggest recession we've had in peacetime in 150 years. So you don't go through something like that and then sort of say, oh, well, it's all going to be over by, August. So I think that's the challenge, is to figure out what is going to be long-term and lasting and what is this sort of short-term impact, as disruptive as it has been.
Yeah. And what's the general sentiment? Like, what are businesses preparing for in terms of the timeline to get back to some kind of like normalcy or a new world? What do you see?
I'm not sure that companies really have clarity yet on when the new normal will arrive. So we're sitting here in Singapore. We start phase 2 on Friday. Hallelujah. That's fantastic. But none of us are in our offices. And not only are we not in our offices, we have no clarity on when we might be in our offices, because there hasn't even been a timeline. We're not in phase 3. We're in, I don't know when, like after the vaccine, I don't know. It's very unclear. So we can be enthusiastic that you can finally see 5 human beings outside of your own house. Hallelujah. You know, you can go shopping, you can eat in a restaurant with 5 people, fantastic. But your life is still not back to normal. And in particular, your office life is not back to normal. And even when it is back to normal, what does that look like? And who are my customers and who are my clients? And I need to make sure that I'm reaching out to people. I'm not traveling. You know, all of us travel a ton, and here we're not traveling at all. So what does that normal look like? Unclear. How fast will it arrive? Also unclear. And I think it's unclear for large firms. It's unclear for small firms. I think we all expect that at some point we're going to go back and do something that looks a bit more familiar. But what timeline is that? Is it Friday? Probably not. Is it a couple months? Maybe. Is it next year? Maybe. I think that's the sort of uncertainty that's still lingering.
Yeah. And Simon, when you look at public policy across the region, what do you see governments doing about this at the moment? What has the reaction been from the various governments?
Well, it's been really interesting, isn't it? Because we've definitely seen, and this goes to one of the things that Parag talked about, this multipolarity. It really has been every kind of nation for themselves. There has been, this has not been a case of the community of nations coming together. Far from it, really. And we've never seen anything quite like this in terms of the effective closing of borders. We've been just so used to being able to travel, and so to see that coming up, and I expect we've all got friends or colleagues who are kind of stuck in we have I know some people are stuck in Bali, and we might think that's luxury, but actually I expect it's not. I expect it really isn't a great place to be stuck at the moment. So that kind of insular approach, I think, is quite worrying in terms of how does that play out longer term. And we also see when it comes to the tech space that there is a sense of some people wanting to kind of accelerate action against tech companies for the disruption that they may have caused. And that some of the sectors, particularly publishing, where they want to blame tech for what's happened to their business model. Then we see examples of Australia and just this week Vietnam of threats to say, okay, we're going to force the tech companies to effectively pay for the news industry in our country. So there's all kinds of different things going on. But we also see some great examples, some fantastic uses of tech by governments to inform citizens about how to keep themselves safe, about kind of public policy decisions. The best example that those of us in Singapore, I'm sure, are very familiar with is Singapore was the first government to really use WhatsApp to communicate every day with citizens about what's going on. Actually, not just citizens, anybody who's here. What's going on and what are we doing? And I think that kind of direct engagement with the population is a fantastic new development, and in terms of transparency and accountability. And we see lots of examples of that across the region. So as ever, just as Deborah and Parag said, there's so many different things going on here. It's very hard to figure out which of these ones are going to play out in the long term and which are just going to be features of this very unusual year.
That's interesting. So I wanted to touch a bit on businesses, because I know we have a lot of business owners and senior business leaders in the audience. And if you had $1 million to start a business right now, whether it be like a competitor to Zoom, if anyone has thought of it, or face masks you can actually breathe in, that would be a great business idea, I think. But the audience, if you can type in your answer, like if you had $1 million right now, what would you do to capitalize on this opportunity? What kind of businesses would you start? That'd be very interesting to know. And a question to Deborah from since not that many people would have, let's say, $1 million in liquidity to start a business, what would you advise businesses to do, one thing right now that would help them become more competitive?
So I think there are lots of things. Again, it depends on what you do and where you do it. But if you're not online, you're not in business. I mean, we knew that to begin with, but we particularly know that now. So whatever you could do to make sure that some portion of your business is online, is conducted online, that your staff have the experience to be online, that they know what they're doing, et cetera. So digital obviously is crucial. And the second thing, which is what is driving a ton of business to us, and again, this will be slightly self-serving when you sit in a trade center, but helping firms use whatever levers they have to make themselves more competitive is crucial. And so for us, we're one of the rare companies doing very well so far out of this, because we're helping companies who are looking for sources of competitiveness and suggesting that we map what they do with the trade agreement benefits that are available to them. And it's particularly nice that we sit in Asia, which is why I still sit in Asia after all this time, because this is the place where the benefits are the greatest. So working with different kinds of firms, large and medium, the smaller ones a little bit less because they're so, deer in the headlights, not sure what to do, to figure out how can you harness the benefits that are possible in a region that is full of overlapping trade agreements so that your products or your services have more competitiveness in a market than someone else's who's not doing the same thing. So I think those are two suggestions, obviously online, digital, et cetera, and then harnessing any levers that you have that make you more competitive relative to your others in the market. And for us, that happens to be trade agreements, but I think I guess it depends on the sector that you're in, is something you need to do. So thinking now about how do I set myself up, how do we survive, but then how are we positioned for growth going forward?
Interesting. So we have a lot of great ideas here in the chat window. We have investing in companies, we have drone delivery service, e-commerce, deliver essential products, online distribution, digital learning, healthcare, tools for remote work collaboration, lots of different ideas. Parag, from your perspective, which of these businesses would do best in an Asian future, do you think?
Well, you've given us hypothetically $1 million, and a lot of these suggestions are pretty capex intensive. Like drone delivery is not something you can start on the cheap. So I was thinking more like a Tinder app for jobs. I mean, if you think about higher unemployment, what you want to be doing is creating, in the spirit of actually Deborah's role as a platform for businesses to do better, to make more of themselves and take advantage of the situation. You want to be a low-cost platform for all of the people that are who are unemployed or looking for new work. You want to be that swipe mechanism to quickly sort through what opportunities there are. If you think about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago with the financial crisis and the number of people who wound up becoming, freelancers out of that and still are freelancers. And now all of the new people entering the job market since then, who are inevitably freelancers, especially now after COVID, what's most important for them is just efficiency in the labor market, not presuming that each job they get is going to last for 5 years and then they move to the next one. It could be 5 days, 5 minutes. So I know obviously it's not a novel idea in the sense that there's many ways in which you can go about searching for work online, but I don't think that there's one single, really efficient, really well curated, by skill, by availability, by location, by time commitment, by wage app. If there is, that's great, fantastic. I hope that person is a billionaire. But I'm not the right person to know whether or not that exists or not, because I'm not in that situation.
You're not.
But it's obviously a good idea. If it didn't exist, you'd have to.
Already a billionaire. That's what it is.
Excellent. So, and what about a tender for drone delivery services? How would that work in like delivering from India to China to Singapore? How would that work?
Your drones don't go that far.
It would be last mile delivery. So it would be from the warehouse, for Amazon here in Singapore to your house. I mean, that would be that last mile, which is always the most difficult part of e-commerce anyways. And if you could do it drone delivery, particularly in densely populated residential areas where you could imagine here in Singapore that the condominiums and the HDB flats would have some place where the drone could land and then distribute packages, I suppose that way. That would be a possible use case for it, but I think that is more than $1 million to invest, at least to really make it practical. But it's something that you can imagine coming forward because of the current pressures on COVID. Now, whether it stays in place is less clear, In other words, right now that sounds very exciting to have contactless delivery. How long do we want to have contactless delivery? Do we need to have it after the pandemic? Hard to say. I mean, I can imagine there's going to be a lot of unemployed people who can do delivery, with wages that were much lower than they used to be. So again, it's sort of a tension here between what you would like to have happen and what the reality is for firms in the market space. And I can imagine any firm scooping up unemployed people and saying, you're now a delivery driver, good luck to you.
Exactly.
I have a different view on that. I think we need contact-full delivery. Sometimes it's the only person I see every day is the person who delivers something, and it's quite nice to see another human being. We don't tend to chat very much, but it's still good. I think there's an opportunity somewhere between, I mean, Parag mentioned Tinder, somewhere between Tinder and Facebook. This sense, because Facebook's all about people you already know, Tinder's about people you don't know, but it's very much focused on one aspect of life. But that sense of human connection, and particularly for people, for loneliness and mental health, they're kind of using some kind of platform as a place where people can go, not to find love, but just to find comfort and empathy, and to kind of address issues around loneliness. I reckon there's something there. Again, I'm not sure $1 million will get you started to try something like that out, but I think there's a tremendous opportunities in that space.
There's a broader point that I think both Simon and Deborah are making, which is something to keep in mind for any entrepreneur, which is that this pandemic and the policy response is probably the first time people have been forced to reckon with the terminology of essential versus non-essential services. And this is critical because with each phase of the opening, sectors are designated in one basket or the other. And it becomes, sort of for your company, life and death, at least temporarily, whether or not you are designated essential or non-essential. So let's say you are starting a new business today. You want to be doing something that is essential, right? And great entrepreneurs are always saying, if you want to start a new company, think about a problem that people have and solve it. When people who work in impact investing always say, think about these enduring problems that societies face and tackle those. Well, those are essential issues. So, if you have any fiber of humanity in your body and you're thinking about a new company today, you should really be focusing on all of the gaps in public welfare and social services, whether it's mental health or whether it is logistics for those people, delivery to those people who can't just go out and do their shopping 12 times a day, especially during a lockdown. The world is still full of dire, deep, desperate needs, that are truly, truly essential. And we should be building much more robust business models around those things. And one hopes that all governments in the world coming out of this pandemic have realized that so too many of their citizens are vulnerable and underserved, and B, the people who work in essential areas do not get paid enough. Right? They do not get paid enough. We do not pay educators, garbage men, whatever the case may be, nearly enough for the jobs that they do. So whether you're posing this as just a private sector dilemma or something that is more broadly around what public and private sector can do together, for God's sakes, every country needs to do a lot more in essential services and making them resilient and paying people what they deserve for doing that.
That's very true. I saw a poll in the Sunday Times where it said the most necessary, the most essential jobs, and the top was like garbage and cleaner and nurse and so on. And then next to that, they had a list of all the jobs that people didn't want to do, and it was exactly the same jobs. But people didn't want to be a cleaner or like garbage delivery and so on. So I think that's very interesting. And something that I've heard a lot from business leaders recently as well is that suddenly everything is happening super quickly, right? I was a head of a big bank who told me that he had this digital thing he wanted to drive through, and it was stuck in conversations forever. But then because of COVID, it happened in a matter of days, right? Is that something that you've seen at a government and policy level as well? Are things moving a lot quicker now because of COVID and they want to push things through, or?
I'm happy to come in on that. Look, I mean, from a company point of view, as a big company, Facebook's got 50,000 employees around the world. We transitioned to everybody working from home really fast. And lots of other companies have done the same. And to fundamentally change the way in which we work, I mean, this is a company which is, the office culture was incredibly strong. One of the ways we attracted candidates to come and work for Facebook was building these amazing places to work. So that kind of transition was incredible. And I think we do see examples of acceleration in decision making because you've got to make decisions fast about when you're going to enter lockdown. And it's harder to figure out when you're going to come out, and those tend to be slower. But I do think there are lots of examples here a faster decision making, and also probably certainly countries in which they'd acted quicker.
What are some examples of that, and perhaps the more encouraging ones?
Well, in terms of governments, look, I think there are going to be volumes written by academics and others around kind of who got this right and why. There's going to be a fascinating story to tell about what happened in Singapore in terms of getting it right for a large section of the population, but not for others who are in our community. That's not to say they're not in the community. They are people who are the overseas workers in the dormitories. And just understanding that, I think, is going to be very difficult. But, look, the obvious ones are, New Zealand really got on top of it very quickly and have done an amazing job. South Korea have done a good job, the Hong Kong authorities, etc. And I would argue that actually, China, when you think about the risk for China, did an amazing job, domestically in controlling this. And obviously at the time, it felt amazingly draconian. Certainly for somebody like me who didn't live through SARS in this region. But, they did an amazing job of containing it pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the evidence from governments, though, I think is a bit mixed. So while they're able to mobilize in many respects to handle COVID specifically, other parts of government have gotten snarled because while everyone is focused on COVID, nothing else is happening in many parts of the world in the government space because their staff are also at home. Many governments are really, really wretched at doing work from home, have never done so, have no capacity. They don't have computers. They don't have all kinds of things. So I think there's a real mix among governments in terms of how they're handling their policy. Some things are being rushed through, and in particular, what worries me, because we deal with policy, is some quickly rushed through policy decisions that respond potentially to this moment, or are at least seizing the moment as the crutch to shove through stuff. That is poorly thought out, that will end up with being with us forever, because that's how policy works. You put it in place and it just, sails on forever, which turn out to be very problematic. And so we see this in a lot of different countries in this region, and especially now, or maybe it's just because I happen to be in this space, in digital. We see it in supplies, medical supplies, logistics. We see it in some of the areas that are regarded as essential now in food. So there are some problematic policies that I think are either in place or coming, partly because governments are struggling with how do they make policy when they are at home or when they are disrupted in a world that has been changed so dramatically. That's, it's challenging for everyone. It's also challenging for governments. But if we're not having communication between government, and if government is not talking to companies, the risk for me is that we end up with worse outcomes going forward than we would otherwise need to have.
It's very similar to within companies as well, where everything is kind of slowed except for the COVID focus, right? And making sure that everything works.
Exactly.
That's true. Parag, have you seen any difference in the perception or relations with China, given that it came from China, but China has also recovered quicker? What is China screwed in terms of their international relations, or what's happening over there?
Well, even before the pandemic, we weren't in a situation where relations with China between other countries in the region were sort of, hunky-dory. That's not been the case. There's, decades worth of pent-up frustration. People tend to view these things in micro cycles as if everyone's rallying around China. No, everyone hates China. The fact is that there's been, rising suspicion of China for 25 years, at least, around the region among many, many of China's neighbors. And obviously, the more aggressive it's become, the more debt traps there have been through Belt and Road and other kinds of, tiffs that are happening bilaterally, the more concern you've seen across the region. I spend a lot of my time in China's neighbors, basically, whether it's Myanmar, Kazakhstan, or Mongolia. And these are all countries that, quite frankly, I helped them design, their policies to curtail Chinese influence that they're so worried about. And so, this notion that, everything was fine until the pandemic came along, and now we blame China. And it's actually there's more continuity, you might say. But I would say that to the extent that you could possibly believe that Asia could somehow form a coherent sort of system with China at the center, which is everything that I argue against, right? But if you did believe that, that argument's obviously now dead. This is as if SARS wasn't bad enough, and Belt and Road debt traps, and obviously aggression in the South China Sea, and all these other things. As if all of that wasn't bad enough, now you have COVID and the lack of transparency around that. So again, as I said, prior to COVID, you had the beginnings and the formation of these counter-China coalitions, the Quad arrangement. Now, Trump is talking about a G11. The UK is talking about a D10. All of these, whatever acronym and combination of numbers, letters and numbers you choose, are all about how to, again, pull your eggs out of the China basket, develop more autonomy in production, make sure that you have competitive firms and industries to Chinese technology, and also obviously geopolitical ability to constrain China. So all of those things are now going to accelerate. But I just want to be clear in terms of the sequencing, all of this has been happening for actually quite a long time. When I was maybe the age of many of your members and participants in the 2000s, living in Washington at the Brookings Institution, we used to convene, this is now more than 15 years ago, we used to convene what we called the Global NATO workshops. We pulled in Japanese, Indian, and Australian diplomats to work on this idea of a coalition of democratic states to contain China's rise. Does that sound familiar? I mean, that was 15 years ago. I was like a kid then. So there's actually nothing new going on here. It's just to remind everyone that this time it's really for real. Let's put it that way. That this is the sort of constrained China coalition is the fundamental feature of geopolitical life for everyone who is alive today. Even if you're 10 years old, it will be the story of your life for the next decades. I want to be clear about that. I don't see any alternative to that set of, the coordination that's underway now.
Interesting. And on the tech side of things, Simon, are big tech companies going to capitalize on this pandemic? Because everything is just becoming more and more digital, right? And digital is already the winner. So they're going to capitalize on this, or are they going to assert their dominance, or are they going to actually help even more in this situation?
Well, I think, look, we're not all the same in terms of the tech companies, but certainly those tech companies that are able to already got kind of strong offerings in, for instance, the kind of remote working and entertainment or gaming, in e-commerce, health tech, social connection, they're going to do better, of course, because all of those things are of value to people in chain settings and businesses in chain settings. Now, in a lot of those spaces, there's tremendous competition. And so, who actually wins? Well, it depends on how good your product is, how well you're able to serve people, how well you're able to adapt your products to different settings for different people. And so there's all kinds of things that can affect that. But if your business is in travel tech, kind of maybe you're involved in events, or you're kind of really caught up in the US-China nexus, or maybe your business is all around kind of the office environment, real estate, it's going to be tough for you. And you really feel for people who were working in an Airbnb, or companies had to lay off thousands of people because although it was a very successful tech business, it was just in the wrong place to be. So for us as Facebook, we've undoubtedly benefited from the fact that many hundreds of thousands, millions of people are using our services that weren't using them before. And typically it is about that kind of last 20, 30% of people in a country which is already well connected, who are just not using these services. So I expect all of us have got kind of parents, or maybe with your audience, grandparents, who are using technology for the first time. My father is a lay preacher. He's using Zoom and Facebook Live. And this is a guy who never had even had a mobile phone before. So those kind of things, I think, are really quite dramatic. But also, what's really interesting for me is the most successful company in terms of, is the company we're using right now, Zoom. And how many people knew Zoom or were using Zoom before? It's not one of the established big tech companies that's just had this incredible product that works amazingly well for this kind of setup. And who would have thought? So it's that dynamism of the tech sector and innovation which is going to still be a great feature of this time. And then you asked about, are we going to help more? Well, of course, I would say, look, we already help quite a lot in terms of communities and economies and democracies and people's lives in terms of the connection we provide. And what's happened for our company in the last few months is that Mark Zuckerberg completely pivoted the company to say, we are going to focus on doing everything we can to help the world. We have now 3 billion people using our services. Let's see what we can do to help make sure they get the best information, accurate information from health authorities about what to do. Let's try and limit misinformation and harmful content. Let's support health authorities. So we've been doing we've massively supported WHO and other health authorities with ad credits, etc., to get good information out there. And then let's support local communities and businesses through this crisis. So enormous amounts of effort in the company to do everything we can through our products to just help the world through this. Does that mean we're taking advantage? No, I think that means we're doing what we should do, which is using our products to help humanity get through this. And there's still a long way to go. So there will be more to come from Facebook and other companies, I'm sure, to do what we can to help.
I see. And on the topic of inequality, I want to ask the audience, do you think that COVID will be making the rich richer and the poor poorer? Because there have been some questions around, like, is this further dividing, bringing more like digital divide? The knowledge workers are benefiting, the big tech companies are benefiting, and knowledge workers in the big tech companies are benefiting, whereas the people are in less, like, lower paid jobs are not benefiting as much. So let's see, we have 50% having voted. A few more seconds. And then we'll see what the panel thinks of this as well. 3, 2, 1. So 88% think that COVID will be making the rich richer and the poor poorer. What are your comments on this? This is the opposite of the optimistic future that everyone had at the beginning of this webinar.
Well, I think, I mean, I'll just go, I guess, and let other people come in just a second. I mean, the reason why I think the poor may get poorer is because if you, first of all, you are at higher risk of both getting COVID and potentially not doing well as a result of it, because you often have, because you are already poor, you are outside of the healthcare system, or you're on the margins of the healthcare system, which means you could very well have underlying conditions, but you're also often in jobs that require you to be face-to-face contact where you cannot sit and do a Zoom call. So it makes it more challenging in that sense to be someone who is poor facing this pandemic. The long-term implications may not be that dire for the poor. It's a little hard to say because maybe they are suddenly, again, viewed as essential workers, some of them. Maybe they are able to find jobs that would otherwise have been closed. Hard to say. So I think the poor clearly being differentially impacted by COVID, at least at this moment. Will they stay there? Hard to say. The rich always survive. They always survive. So I'm assuming that they will do just fine. But I would also note what I find interesting about COVID that I think has been a bit surprising is the companies that we've been talking to who had been doing very well. Now, these are not, your multi-billionaires, but companies that have been doing quite well. And in many respects, they have had business models that have collapsed overnight. And so all of a sudden, what was a very thriving business is not. That's a bit unexpected. Normally, you don't see businesses just collapse especially in unexpected areas. So I'm not sure that all of the rich are going to do well. Some are likely to find themselves suddenly in a business model that no longer works, unable to pivot fast enough, et cetera. I think that the impact is going to be differential. But inequality is going to be with us for a while, because while we would like to say it would be great to come back and build a better world at the end of this crisis, to invest in sustainability, to invest in jobs, good jobs, et cetera, I think that's going to be tough. And I think it's going to be tough because governments are strapped. They've spent a lot of money. They're going to be searching for revenue everywhere they can. And businesses are strapped. So businesses, I find it hard to imagine that even though they might want to invest in building a better world, that they're going to have the cash resources to do so. So while I would love to, the optimist in me would love to see us come out of this cleaner, greener, with happier jobs, with higher salaries for everyone, I think that is a fantasy to think it will happen.
There's such an interesting congruity in your two surveys, Nellie, because most people were optimistic and most people think the rich are getting richer. So I think that tells us something about your demographic on this call. There's a reason why people seem optimistic. We can all at least afford to be on Zoom, those of us that are here. But Deborah is right, and just to break it down a bit further, remember these two major kinds of inequality in the world, international and domestic, right? The international inequality that has been declining in recent decades because of poverty alleviation in many dozens of poorer countries. Quite a bit of that is on the brink of being erased, right, as a result of COVID. If you think about the poor commodities-dependent exporting countries in a situation like we have right now, they stand to lose a great deal as trade networks and supply chains rupture and demand reduces for their exports and so forth. So it's the international inequality that's been being chipped away at for several decades is being unwound every single day. Then there's the domestic inequality, where I think Deborah's right that it really depends on if you mean sort of short-term, long-term. Short-term, if you lost your job and you were poor and you had no savings and you're a manual laborer, this is not good. Longer term, though, if you have immigration restrictions, which I generally am not the kind of person who would favor, but they are happening. What that does, obviously, is restrict labor supply, and it can lead to wages rising. And that's what's happened in previous instances of plagues and pandemics, given the impact that they have on migration. That's exactly what Trump, quite frankly, is trying to engineer. He was trying to engineer before the pandemic, but this just gives him an excuse to do it. The theory is obviously that you constrain immigration, then you will increase wages. The reality is it doesn't actually work that way, because you have a mismatch in the labor market between people's skills and what people are needed to do. So you need both immigration and skills training. But what I see happening is this huge fiscal policy emphasis, right? You've got governments around the world saying, we are going to hold you to account. Every dollar that gets lent to a multinational, better go towards keeping workers in their jobs and so forth. And then, leaving aside the $500 billion that Trump has given to companies and not disclosed who they are, just put that $500 billion aside. But more broadly, you have a lot of countries saying, first of all, we've got to get people working again. This is going to strengthen efforts for universal, wage insurance and medical care and these kinds of things in countries that don't have it, and raising the minimum wage as well and that kind of thing. So these are all fairly progressive ideas that, again, predate the pandemic, no doubt. But given the extent of the crisis, you can't simply, 2 weeks from now, walk away and say, oh, well, that agenda, that was just because of COVID, right? You've got structural unemployment for a very long time to come, and you're going to need to have a reinvention of the social contract in many ways in countries. And we'll see now the competition, because we don't live in a world, Simon rightly said this at the beginning, every nation for itself. You don't really have, a global consensus nor a global pot of money to make this happen. What we'll see here is which countries are genuinely governed in a way that is utilitarian and which ones are not. And I have my very, I have my very clear views on which is which, and I assess them as such. I've written a lot about it. I think that, what's in the DNA of the social contract in the society, there are probably limits to how much they can reinvent themselves. But we're going to see which ones sink or swim, or at least which ones, what's the kind of place you would want to live in if you were someone who had lost your job right now, because if you were Greek or Italian or Portuguese, you're probably better off right now in terms of the social benefits that you're getting than if you're an American, right, or something like that. And you can make many of these comparisons. And it has a lot to do with, how bad was COVID in your country, right? It's really what kind of public policies have been dictating your political and socioeconomic model for the last 75 years. That's what's being, very painfully revealed right now.
Wow, that is a pretty tough kind of person to follow. I think that's brilliant analysis of how to think about this. And I suppose it just demonstrates, but look, we know with polls, it's just far too simple a question, isn't it? there's going to be so many different ways in which this goes. Trying to write the kind of equation of what equals successful, fair country, and then it just got much more complicated. It was always complicated, but it's gotten much more so. And I think it's fascinating to see the kind of rich countries that have handled this badly, and then the poor countries like Vietnam, relatively poor, that have handled it incredibly well. But that doesn't guarantee that if you've handled it well, as Parag was saying, that you'll come out of it in a good place, because you're so dependent on those rich countries demanding your goods. And so the interactions of different countries as they come out of this, I think is going to be just fascinating to watch. And, I think we're all, I hesitate to say we're kind of lucky that we get to see this incredibly disruptive event without the kind of, the last time this happened is World War, right? It's not a world war. Yes, lots of people have lost their lives. It's terrible. But we get to be part of the recovery. And I think the kind of community you've got in Tigerhall, of these people who are kind of interested in our views about all this and some of the things that have been shared in the group, I think we should be optimistic that there's tremendous energy about how do we help the world recover from this. And it's right across the world. And we've got brilliant people in different places that can help do it. So that's why I'm still an optimist, despite probably my sense of, yes, I think that's probably right, because generally that's what's happened in life. The rich can, as Deborah put it so well, the rich can ride out. That's the whole point. What's what money gives you, and wealth gives you. It gives you the ability to ride out bad times. But the long term, I'm still optimistic.
So that brings us really nicely into the Q&A. We've got a lot of questions from the audience, so feel free, everyone, to keep putting your questions into the Q&A. The first one is from Darren, that I think is a good question. What does the current crisis tell us about the efficiency of governance in Asia versus Europe, the UK, and the US? What does it tell us about the different governments? First, Parag can start.
Sure. I guess just picking up on what we were discussing earlier. First of all, we can't generalize about any of these three regions, right? We have a vast diversity of governments. You would obviously, just comparing Canada and America tells you a lot about how, even when you have two countries that supposedly have a lot in common, there's a lot of things they also don't have in common. And if people were crashing the immigration website of Canada when Trump got elected, if that site were even available right now, because I think the Canadians were smart enough to probably take it down, you would imagine it would have crashed again. And actually, individual US states are trying to negotiate bilateral border entry with Canada right now, because that border, the longest border on the planet Earth, by the way, is closed and has been closed for quite some time. So look, we're seeing every day what's happening in the US. I think what's interesting, though, I'll just say from let's say an academic standpoint, is just the sheer complexity of how all these trends intersect. The exact day many states were supposed to reopen from the COVID lockdown is like the day the Black Lives Matter protests began. Now, these things seemingly don't have much to do with each other, and yet they do, right? And they wind up compounding the kind of misery of the moment. And I think that everyone should remember just how complex an organism society is. Europe, again, how can you generalize, right? Sweden is coming out sort of tarnished from this. What's happening in the UK doesn't surprise me, given how much, sort of it is like the US in terms of populism right now. I'm not at all surprised that Germany, has the lowest per capita, sort of casualty rate among large countries. It's a very technocratic society where people follow order, but quite frankly, as it should be, if you ask me. And I'm glad to see Italy has recovered in many ways. It suffered so tremendously early on, but there is this sort of, culture of solidarity, and Italy has pulled together in very important ways, in all of these intangible ways that we appreciate Italy being Italy for, in a way. And Asia, of course, extremely diverse responses. But just to echo Simon's point, you don't have to be a rich country to have gotten this right. It's not about your per capita wealth, right? It's about having, of course, in the case of Asian countries, the historical knowledge and experience of what happened with SARS, having that sense of solidarity, that deference to authority, knowing that this is serious, following the instructions, governments being prepared. Did you see the vending machines for rice? That they put up in Vietnam so that no one would starve, things like this. And I love seeing that, because it's so important. And then most of all, this is an extremely important point that I try to emphasize. This is not about democracy versus authoritarian, right? I mean, in the end, one of the lasting lessons that maybe, just about everyone who's conscious will remember 5 years from now, hopefully, is that such a huge amount of positive attention was shined on Asia's democracies, right? And the majority of people living in Asia, which is the majority of people living in the world, live in democratic societies. There may not be perfect democracies, but they are democracies. And so I think it's good to see the positive attention that Taiwan and South Korea and other countries in the region have gotten, because you do not have to be authoritarian or China to have turned the corner on this, right? And I hope that more people take the time to reflect on how to get that balance of good governance right.
Mm.
Happy to go to the next question, Denny.
Yeah, exactly. And we have another good question on the introduction of universal basic income. Given what we spoke about with the poor getting poorer, do you think it's going to be introduced and we're going to have universal basic income globally?
No, definitely not globally. I think the question is, will a government do it somewhere? And you could argue that effectively you've got, I think that seems more likely now, given what's happened, that you are going to see a government will, in a larger country, will try it. I'm not sure about this region though. I'd be pretty surprised for it to happen here. There's more likely to happen in a European country, or maybe the Middle East, somewhere like that, where there's more wealth to be able to do it. I don't know. I'd be curious to see what others feel about that.
What do you think, Deborah?
I was happy that Simon went. To be honest, do I think we're going to see universal? I think that it will be attempted because it's a very powerful argument that is very simple for people to understand, and that especially coming through COVID, people will. I can imagine it feels like what should happen. So I imagine that governments may try to do so. But I think in the maintaining a universal basic income, if it's at, of course, I could set a universal basic income at such a low level that it is useless to people. And then I could say I have one, but it actually doesn't mean anything. And I think that's not what people are hoping for. They want a universal basic income that is at a high enough level that everyone is sort of comfortable and lives a comfortable life. It doesn't have to be rich, but at least comfortable. And I think that that's intuitively attractive. Of course, everyone would prefer to live a comfortable life. But our history suggests that that is hard to achieve. And I think maintaining anything that would be like a universal basic income is going to be challenging because the cost involved in providing universal basic income to some large group of people, and maintaining that while not having borders open. I mean, I just see so many challenges around this that, as attractive as the idea is, hard to implement. I think what you might see, what makes more sense to me, is to have maybe better social safety nets in place rather than a universal basic income. And also, and I know there's a lot of questions coming in from a lot of different people on education, coupled with better lifelong education, skills development, et cetera, that allows people to continuously upgrade their abilities. I think maybe that's the better approach, rather than say, this is the flat salary that we guarantee, to say, if you have a problem, here's a safety net in place, and we help you continuously improve your ability to thrive and survive.
Mm. So probably a universal Tigerhall access is the answer.
Well, clearly your audience is very, very fond of education. Must be in education, many of them. And I think that it's important. And I think, you know, I've always admired being in Singapore, their focus on skills development, upgrading, reskilling, et cetera. I think that is something that really should spread. Now, whether they're training for the right skills is a different question. Whether they're providing the right revenue, I don't know. But the point is, to have a commitment at government level to continuously upgrade skills of workers, I think is something that other governments should seize on and should take advantage of, especially coming out of COVID, when many jobs that used to exist will not exist or will be dramatically pivoted so that individuals will be struggling to match their own skill set with the demands of the job market.
I agree. I agree. So final question before we wrap up. Last one, what could we have done better as humans when this started? And what have we all learned collectively as humanity, governments, businesses? What have we learned and what could we have done better?
You want us to speak on behalf of 7 billion people? Wow.
Yes. That is the task for the evening.
I think also kind of foresight would have been great. I bet we all think, I bet there's quite a few people who think, you know what, if only I'd booked that trip a little bit earlier. I was one of the lucky ones. I managed to get a trip in back home to the UK and saw my grown-up kids just before it broke. And so I imagine a lot of people would have loved to have foresight. I actually think one of the things that lessons for me is having not been in, I came to this region 2 and a bit years ago. I didn't live through SARS. And therefore when people around me were saying, this is really serious, I'm really not sure about flying anymore. Actually, that kind of mindset that we had in this region was just not there in the rest of the world. And so somehow if we can kind of translate the learning from, if we could have had more of an understanding of what a pandemic can do, I think you would have seen countries lock down sooner and you would have saved more lives. But I think that's a really difficult thing to do, is how you translate learning about something like this, that only happened, like SARS that happened in this region, to the rest of the world.
I read somewhere that, 100 years ago during the Spanish flu, our 3 mechanisms of self-defense and suppression of the pandemic were wearing masks, social distancing, and washing your hands. And here we are 100 years later with all the advances in technology, and our 3 weapons against the pandemic are exactly the same thing. So whether or not any one of us lived through any recent, episode like SARS or have, deeply studied the Spanish flu, the fact is that I wish that people would just take seriously the fact that, okay, some pathogen has entered the society, every society almost instantaneously. Everyone better just stay at home, wash their hands, and wear a mask. And the fact that we have so many COVIDiots out there is deeply frustrating. And it's not just frustrating, it is downright deadly, right? Country by country now, you can run a simple model to show how many more people have died as a result of not doing these common sense things. And I think that's morally unacceptable and politically unacceptable. So in terms of things that we could have done better, I don't think this is an abstract question at all. And I don't care if we have to wait 5 years or 50 years. The whole point of learning in history is so that you don't have to relive a mistake just because you haven't lived it yet. And so I'm deeply, deeply disappointed that we didn't learn that and take that into account.
And your final thoughts, Deborah?
Well, where do you go from there?
Learns for all of us.
I would like to think, again, this is the optimist in me, that we come out of this, those people who've come through this, everyone who's lived this experience that is old enough to remember will be scarred by it, I think. And I would like to think that when you come through on the other side, that you have, at the minimum, a better sense of sort of shared humanity. But I'm nervous that we may go the opposite direction. So the optimist in me says we come through this and at least we have a shared sense of humanity, and you figure out who are your neighbors and you say hello to them and you smile at people that you don't know. So, that kind of thing, that sort of group cohesion and togetherness that I think is lacking. But I'm nervous that, especially as this COVID hit at a time when it exacerbates all kinds of different tensions in different societies, different parts of the world, et cetera, the splits, the tensions will grow and make it even harder for people to come together and have that shared humanity. So I would like to think we will take advantage of this and go forward together. But I'm nervous that if we're not careful, we will actually fragment even more in more ways. And it will be even a rockier, longer path back to whatever is the new normal.
Excellent. And with those last words, thank you so much, Simon, Deborah, and Parag. Great pleasure to have you here. We've learned a lot. And for those of you who want to hear more from Simon, Parag, and Deborah, you can find them all on Tigerhall. Simon has a podcast on how do you defend your company during a crisis, for example, which could be very applicable to some of you now. And Parag is more on Asianization, and Deborah more on trade agreements. So you can see them all in the app. Thanks a lot again, and have a great evening and a happy weekend outside of your homes as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. That was really
Bye.
fun.
Bye.